Schreiber. I chose to do my research paper on the deinstitutionalization of status offenders, or DSO. I selected this topic because I think it is a very important turning point for the juvenile justice system. This also interests me because I have a strong desire to help juveniles in my future career. I like how the focus of deinstitutionalization shifted to helping troubled youths get on the right track versus incarcerating them. In 1974, Congress enacted the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, or JJDPA. This was developed after the growing concern for youth crime and delinquency. There are two main purposes of this act. First was to remove any youth who was being held in a correctional facility for a status offense to be released within 2 years. Second was making sure that juveniles were not being held in a facility where they would be exposed to adult convicts. There are certain situations where status offenders may be incarcerated, however. If a status offender is under probationary supervision and violates any court orders or probation conditions, then they may be incarcerated. While JJDPA is not binding in any state, it serves as a guide to law enforcement officials on how to treat juveniles. If juveniles are taken to jail for some reason, they are to be treated differently from adult offenders. Juveniles also should be separated by sight and sound from adult offenders, and they should only be held in a non-secure area for no more than 6 hours. Juveniles are not to be restrained or handcuffed, and their time being detained should remain short, just long enough to identify them and reunite them with family or a youth agency. Status offenses are actions that would not be considered a crime if it was committed by an adult. This includes things such as underage drinking, skipping school, running away, or breaking a local curfew. The purpose of DSO was to separate status offenses from delinquency and criminal offenses and to offer help and treatment to the individuals involved with the status offense. After all, it does not make sense to incarcerate a truant or unruly child with those who have been educated for burglary, arson, murder, or criminal sexual conduct. According to Merlo, Spinecos, and Champion, Congress determined that requiring status offenders to reside and interact with delinquents in secure confinement, especially for prolonged periods of time, is detrimental to the status offender and is inconsistent with the mission of juvenile court. I agree with this because minor unruly behavior should not be confused with a violent crime, and mixing the two together could have a negative impact on the status offender and possibly persuade them to partake in more risky behavior. Another part of the deinstitutionalization movement was dealing with neglected and abused children. While the juvenile court system still has jurisdiction over these youth, there are specific programs developed to receive referrals of these children from sources such as schools, parents, police officers, or the child themselves. This provides crisis intervention for the child, while ultimately aiming to reunite the child with their family. Shelter homes or foster homes are also in place for more serious offenders. Confining youths for status offenses has been found to be both dangerous and ineffective. Prior to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, status offenders were confined to enforce good behavior in them. After the act passed in 1974 and the deinstitutionalization of status offenders started, critics began to question the effectiveness of it. In the mid-1980s, there was a call for tough responses to youth's misbehavior and more control over juveniles. Status offenders included. This led to more institutionalization to pick up again for juvenile status offenders and an increase in court petition cases for status offenders. Research has concluded that confinement of juveniles can actually be quite detrimental. It can remove the youth from their family and community, prohibit the youth from developing social networking skills and the support needed to transition from youth to adulthood, jeopardize the youth's well-being, fails to act as a deterrent for future status offenses, and exposes the status offender to more violent youths. Youths who have been charged with a status offense and also abused and neglected youth may not be placed in detention or confinement. The goal of this is to help the youth receive family or community-based services that may find the root of the bad behavior and help correct it. The Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act has resulted in many different programs and opportunities to better serve status offenders. One part that intrigues me most of this act is keeping the juveniles away from adult offenders. This could have such a negative impact on the child and could be detrimental to their well-being. Also, being exposed to adult offenders would give them a higher chance of being victimized. There are three potential outcomes of deinstitutionalization of juveniles. One is that the reduction of the number of status offenders being confined could happen. Youth may also be brought into the system that previously would not have been involved. Because of programs being established for status offenders and the community offering social services to them, this would mean more youth would come in contact with the system. Also, defining youth as emotionally disturbed and/or delinquent when before they would have been labeled as a status offender. An example of this would be a teenager who violates curfew being labeled as a burglary suspect by police, thus bringing the youth into the juvenile justice system. If a state fails to comply with any of the requirements of JJDPA, their state funding may be reduced by 20% for each requirement not followed. Also, if out of compliance, a state must then use 50% of their remaining funding to regain their compliance with the Act. To make JJDPA more enticing to the states, Congress has offered grant money to those who are in compliance with each JJDPA mandate. The Act has been successful and has contributed greatly to reform the juvenile justice system. This Act is very important to our juvenile justice system because it considered how youth accused of status offenses were being treated. Our youth have diverse needs, much different from adults, so it is critical that we find ways to support and help them as we can. Having a justice system specifically for juveniles is very important because juveniles are not adults and should not necessarily be treated as one. Of course, there are instances when a crime committed by a youth can be tried in adult courts, though many are handled in juvenile court with the aim of rehabilitating the youth. While over the last 40 years, our juvenile system has begun to resemble criminal courts by becoming more adversarial and extending constitutional rights to juveniles, the judges still aim to balance justice with treatments that are intended to rehabilitate the youth. This is important because it gives the juvenile a second chance at a successful future and to get on the right path with education and a career. Thank you very much.